Jaylen Carter adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his Manhattan penthouse, gazing at the sprawling skyline. At just 34, he had built one of the most successful tech companies in the world, defying expectations and breaking barriers in an industry where few people who looked like him reached the top. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. Beside it lay a plain white envelope with no return address, delivered by hand. Inside was a brief, ominous message. Your father needs help. He is living under unbearable conditions. You need to come back. No signature, no explanation. Jaylen's chest tightened as memories resurfaced. His once strong father, James Carter, who had instilled in him the values of hard work and integrity, and the grief-stricken man who had fallen under the control of Annabelle, his stepmother. Jaylen had left home at 18, vowing never to return after watching Annabelle manipulate and dominate his father. Yet something about the letter made it impossible to ignore. The next morning, Jaylen boarded his private jet, returning to the small southern town he had abandoned over a decade ago. As he drove through its neglected streets, the stark contrast to Manhattan was overwhelming. When he finally pulled into the driveway of his childhood home, his heart sank. The once pristine house was now crumbling, peeling paint, overgrown weeds, and an eerie stillness. Annabelle greeted him at the door, her sharp eyes brimming with contempt. "Well, look who decided to grace us with his presence," she sneered. Ignoring her, Jaylen demanded to see his father. Annabelle smirked. "James is occupied." Stepping inside, Jaylen's breath caught at the sight before him. His father on his hands and knees, scrubbing the floor with trembling hands. His clothes were worn, his frame gaunt. This was not the proud man Jaylen remembered. Jaylen dropped to his knees beside his father. "Dad, stop! You don't have to do this." James barely lifted his dull, tired eyes. "I'm fine, son." But he wasn't. Furious, Jaylen turned to Annabelle. "This stops now." Her smirk faltered. "You don't get to walk in here and start making demands. This is my house now. Your father knows his place." But Jaylen wasn't leaving without his father. He helped James to his feet and led him to the car. The fight for his father and their family's legacy had just begun. In a small motel room, James sat silently, staring out the window. "I don't know why you came back," he murmured. "You've got your own life." Jaylen met his father's tired gaze. "I should have come back sooner, but I'm here now. We're going to fix this." His resolve hardened. He needed to understand how Annabelle had stolen everything. Over the next few days, Jaylen uncovered the full extent of her schemes. The deed to their family home had been transferred to her under dubious circumstances. His father's signature barely matching the official records. The family business, once thriving, had been lost after Annabelle manipulated James into taking out loans, only for the money to disappear into accounts under her control. Worse, Annabelle had powerful allies, bankers, politicians, even law enforcement, ensuring no one dared to challenge her. A private investigator, Marvin Ross, confirmed Jaylen's worst fears. Annabelle was running a long con, targeting grieving families, coercing them into signing away their assets, and covering her tracks with corrupt officials. Former neighbors spoke in hushed voices, fearful of crossing her. "She made sure people knew she was in charge," an elderly woman told him, "and anyone who questioned her, they regretted it." Jaylen laid out everything for his father, who sat in stunned silence. "I should have seen it," James muttered. "I let her do this to us." Jaylen placed a hand on his shoulder. "She took advantage of your grief, but it's not too late to make things right." A fire rekindled in James's eyes. "What do we do now?" Jaylen's jaw tightened. "Now we fight." Mapping out a plan, Jaylen marked key locations: the courthouse, the bank, and the family home. Annabelle had built her empire on deception, but he was going to dismantle it, piece by piece. The evidence was damning: fraud, forgery, tax evasion. Yet Jaylen knew Annabelle wouldn't go down without a fight. His father warned him, "She's dangerous." But Jaylen had faced worse. The next morning, he prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Annabelle had spent years playing a game where she always won. This time, she would lose everything. Armed with copies of the damning documents Marvin had uncovered, Jaylen drove to the family home, determined to put an end to Annabelle's schemes. The house looked even worse in the harsh daylight, its peeling paint and broken shutters symbols of the decay she had brought into their lives. Knocking on the door, he waited, and after a long pause, it creaked open. Annabelle stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of annoyance and disdain. Dressed impeccably in a crisp blouse and pearls, she was a stark contrast to the crumbling surroundings. "Back so soon?" she drawled, leaning against the doorframe. "To what do I owe the pleasure this time?" Jaylen didn't bother with pleasantries. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the room. "We need to talk." Annabelle arched an eyebrow, but followed him into the living room. "Is that so? And what could we possibly have to discuss?" Jaylen dropped a folder onto the coffee table, its contents spilling out. Fraudulent deeds, fake loans, and evidence of her connection to corrupt officials. "You've been busy, Annabelle." For a brief moment, her composure faltered, but she quickly recovered, smirking. "You always were good at playing detective, Jaylen, but do you really think you can threaten me? This is my house, my town." "Not for long," Jaylen shot back. "I have enough evidence to bring you down, and I'm not afraid to use it." Annabelle stepped closer, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. "You don't know who you're dealing with, boy. You think you can waltz back into this town and undo everything I built? You have no idea how deep my roots go." Jaylen leaned in, unfazed. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, a scared woman clinging to power she never earned. And I'm not going anywhere." That night, as Jaylen returned to the motel, the weight of the confrontation settled over him. He knew Annabelle wouldn't take his threats lightly. Sure enough, trouble found him sooner than expected. Marvin called, his voice tense. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, Jaylen. Annabelle is reaching out to her contacts, and she's not happy. You need to watch your back." "Let her try," Jaylen said, but unease settled in his gut. The next day, as he and James drove back from a meeting with Marvin, a black SUV appeared in their rearview mirror. At first, it seemed like any other vehicle, but when it matched their every turn, Jaylen's suspicions grew. "Dad, stay calm," he said, his voice low. "They're following us, aren't they?" James murmured, his face pale. Jaylen nodded. "Yeah, but they're not going to scare us off." He took a sharp turn onto a side street, weaving through the narrow roads. The SUV followed like a predator closing in on its prey. Finally, Jaylen pulled into a gas station, parking under the bright lights. The SUV slowed, then sped past, disappearing into the night. James let out a shaky breath. "She's sending people after us now." "It looks that way," Jaylen said grimly. "She's desperate. That means we're getting close." The pressure continued to mount. Annabelle's allies in town pushed back. Banks refused to release records. City officials stopped returning his calls. Even the motel manager avoided him. Then came the attack. One night, Jaylen and James returned to find their motel room ransacked. Papers were scattered, furniture overturned, and scrawled in red paint on the wall was a chilling message. "Leave or else." James slumped into a chair, his face pale. "This is my fault. I should have stopped her years ago." Jaylen placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't your fault, Dad. It's hers. And this just proves how scared she is." Determined, Jaylen doubled down. He filed a police report, though he knew the local authorities wouldn't help. Instead, he worked with Marvin to strengthen their case and reached out to national media, knowing public exposure could be their best weapon. As days passed, Annabelle unraveled. Witnesses saw her arguing with associates, her carefully crafted image of control slipping. But Jaylen knew a cornered animal was the most dangerous. The final confrontation was coming. The morning of the showdown was overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Jaylen stood at the motel parking lot, holding the folder that contained everything. Proof of Annabelle's fraud, her bribes, and the network of corruption she had built. Beside him, James sat in the passenger seat, his face hardened with resolve. "Today's the day, Dad," Jaylen said. "We're not leaving that house without taking back what's ours." James nodded. "Let's finish this." They arranged the meeting at the family home, ensuring key players were present. Marvin, a national journalist, and, unbeknownst to Annabelle, federal agents who had been quietly investigating her. Annabelle stood on the front steps, her usual arrogance intact. "I see you brought reinforcements," she sneered. "A pity none of this will help you." Jaylen ignored her, holding up the folder. It's over, Annabelle. We have everything. And I've brought people who are very interested in hearing your explanation. As the journalist and federal agent stepped forward, Annabelle's confidence wavered. This is my house, she shrieked. You have no right. You stole this house, Jaylen said. And now the truth is coming out. The journalist fired pointed questions, recording every word. When Marvin presented bank records showing Annabelle siphoning money into offshore accounts, her defenses crumbled. Then the federal agent stepped in. Mrs. Annabelle Carter, one of them said, flashing a badge. You are under investigation for multiple counts of fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. We suggest you cooperate. Annabelle's face went pale. Her hands trembled. You can't do this. This is my home. Jaylen stepped closer, his voice steady. It's not your home. It never was. And now it's over. As the agents led Annabelle away, James turned to Jaylen. We did it. Jaylen nodded. Yeah, Dad, we did. Over the following weeks, Jaylen restored the house, but he had bigger plans. The Carter Community Center, dedicated to helping families like theirs. The center offered free legal aid, financial literacy programs, and resources for those affected by corruption. James found new purpose, teaching others how to recognize manipulation. At the center's grand opening, Jaylen addressed the crowd. This house has seen pain, but today it stands as a symbol of resilience and hope. This is not just my family's home. It's a place for everyone who has ever felt powerless. The applause was thunderous. For the first time in years, Jaylen felt peace. The battle had been long and grueling, but it had created something greater, a legacy of justice and community. Together, he and his father had reclaimed not just their home, but their future. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out our other videos for more inspiring stories.